Welcome to Foreign Countries, Conversations in Archaeology with me, Ash Lenton. If you're enjoying Foreign Countries and you want to hear more episodes, please become a patron of the show for just $2 a month. Go to the website and click the patron button, foreigncountries.podbean.com. In this episode, we're talking about a fascinating subject. It's the role of metalworkers in early medieval society. Much has been published on the metal artefacts, but until now actually very little on the smiths themselves, and how this very particular type of person lived and acted, which is surprising in archaeology that is meant to be the study of people in past societies. My guest is Dr. Duncan W. Wright of Newcastle University. Duncan published a thought-provoking paper in medieval archaeology called Crafters of Kingship, which looked to understand the roles of early medieval smiths in an ever-changing world. Welcome, Duncan. We're not going to talk too much about metalwork in early medieval Europe. Your interest in this paper is in the actual people, the smiths themselves.
My main interest is the lives and the life cycles and something of the biography of early medieval smiths, these people who make these wonderful objects, the things we go and see in places like the British Museum, and we sort of gawp at their skill and their craftsmanship, and trying to fill out who were the people who made these wonderful things. My observation for some time has been that we find it hard to reconcile these wonderful objects with, especially the settlement archaeology of early medieval sites, often seen as sort of brown stains in the ground, post holes, earth-fast timber buildings. And so it's trying to understand further these individuals. We have some hints of their lives, small bits of evidence in things like documentary sources.
Yeah, this is an historical period, but there aren't too many documents available in the British Isles, at least.
But very, very few in the 5th and 6th centuries. So it's trying to map across the entirety of the early medieval period, so roughly sort of 400 to 1100, as it's defined certainly in the British Isles and Ireland. And yeah, it's explore across Northwest Europe who these people were.
So what do we know about them?
There are some, in terms of the hints in the documentary sources, we have certainly a definition between status. There are clearly individuals who are tied to royal courts who seem to be elite people themselves. They're valued quite highly in the law codes. And they're quite distinct from people who are making stuff in more normal communities, sort of hammering fence posts and hinges on doors or what have you, that more common thing. So especially my focus was on the elite smiths of this period and their role within the high status milieu of that period, and especially tracking change. It's a bit of a trope, really, that smiths are seen as these valuable people but in some way marginalised, and that relies partly on the famous story of Wayland the Smith, who's actually first recorded in detail in the 13th century by Snorri Sturluson, who gives us lots of our data on Norse mythology. He details the story of Wayland, who's this very valuable and very impressive metal worker, and he's kidnapped by an evil king called Nithad, imprisoned on a lake island and forced to act as the royal goldsmith. And he exacts this bloody revenge. He rapes the king's daughters, he murders the sons, and he escapes on wings that he's fashioned himself. And things like Wayland and that story and other bits of the documentary sources we have been used to develop this idea of smiths as a conflicted character, valuable yet malign. But we can do more than that with the archaeological evidence, and we actually can see the status of the smith in early medieval society change over time, and that's principally related to the status of kingship and rulership in the period.
Yeah, it's one of those periods where archaeological evidence far outweighs the historical evidence. So which are the key sites that you've used?
Well, thinking of it in specifically looking at these elite smiths working within the retinues of royal courts, the focus has been especially to look at high status sites. Yeavering is the famous and best excavated example, certainly in mainland Britain, of a high status site where you've got this remarkable monumental timber complex. I think palatial is a fair word to call it, excavated very thoroughly by Brian Hope Taylor in the 1950s. And then at a slight remove, this prehistoric henge that seems to be reused in the early medieval period for metalworking, and that's been recognised for some time now. So it's trying to identify sites that will have clearly what the high status focus is, but also the metalworkers and the evidence for that around them as well. And Glastonbury Tor is an excellent example of that, a rare example in Western Britain of the period where you've got datable evidence as well, because you've got this imported Mediterranean pottery. You find that at the Abbey site. You also find it on sites like Tintagel on the southwest peninsula as well.
I didn't realise Glastonbury Tor was a metalworking site. It's really steep and the plateau is really quite narrow.
And there, yeah, quite remarkably at Glastonbury Tor, it's quite a difficult summit to get up to, but you have clearly a series of what look like 6th century metalworking paths, and initially interpreted by Wright as either some sort of outlook or a military function, which I don't think really fits with the evidence, or a hermitage. He said it might be a hermitage. And I think the way of thinking of it as a hermitage is not entirely inappropriate, but the main thing that's happening there is metalworking. And this is clearly, to my mind, must be performative metalworking, because it's a very isolated spot. There's no natural resource of where it was ironworking taking place there.
What do you mean by performative?
Iron is not being extracted there, it's not being processed there, it's being taken up along with the fuel and everything else that is required. And this is happening probably episodically, I think, because I don't think it's where you have your metalworking on a normal day-to-day basis. It's very much a performative thing. So I think this is where we start to see the close relationship of metalworking and the oversight of metalworking and kingship and rulership and that control of it. And at Glastonbury, there's quite an enigmatic site, but I think you can see it in a very, I hate to use the term ritualistic, but certainly a ceremonial or performative way.
But you weren't looking at burials at all?
Like all good archaeologists, I've cherry-picked my data and I've looked at these elite sites, these high-status sites, and particularly the settlement evidence. I've not really explored the burial evidence so much. That has been the focus of individuals buried with metalworking tools, has been a focus in the past. And I think that's very important and very interesting. But I think actually it's the settlement evidence that's been overlooked to some extent. And also what metalworkers are doing beyond just making metal objects. And that sounds a bit odd to say, but increasingly in my research, I noticed that we see on the closure of buildings on settlement sites and other monuments in the landscape, we see metalworking tools go into the ground in these processes of what you might call ritual closure or killing. And so you have a question whether this is just the objects that are important, or is it actually the metalworkers themselves that are involved in this process.
Involved how?
It's well recognised that smiths are probably decommissioning objects in the same way that they're charged with making objects. So objects that go into the ground, that go into graves, sometimes are killed quite skillfully or annealed and decommissioned. And it appears, I think, through this research that you're actually getting the smith doing that beyond the objects. They're actually doing it in sort of buildings to monuments, particularly high status buildings, things like halls. And so you've got a broader question. I think what the research is probably, for me, the most interesting aspect is actually smiths as more holistic overseers of production and killing, are these agents in society that are charged with broader cycles of creation and destruction.
You said you were cherry picking, but you've actually used quite a broad number of case studies, and from the continent as well.
I was attempting to get a grip of what was happening across Northwest Europe, because so much of the evidence, certainly in Britain, when you start looking at it, is across this east-west divide. So across that, what people might define as Germanic or Anglo-Saxon culture, in inverted commas, on the eastern side of Britain, was traditionally seen as the Anglo-Saxon areas, and the West. And the patterns of behaviour and the patterns in the archaeology are consistent throughout. And so I started to look at other case studies across Northwest Europe and see where the material had come from. I think especially in Scandinavia, I think the process of conversion and what happens to smiths in that is very important. And I think the great benefit of looking to Scandinavia is the later conversion. So you've got a few more centuries there in which to look at smiths and their role as almost cultic figures in those systems of rulership.
Borgring in Zealand is what, 10th century?
Borgring is a very good case study where you have relatively recently identified Trelleborg Fort, and the limited excavations that I think are still ongoing now so far have identified a gatehouse at that site. it appears that gatehouse has been deliberately burnt and razed to the ground. But fascinatingly, in one of the post holes of that gatehouse, you've got an assemblage of metalworking tools, and we get that quite a lot in these substantial buildings. Now, from what I can tell, and I've not seen published material on this, it's more from the popular press releases, but it appears that the excavators were trying to work out whether this was a forge and that it had been burnt somehow. There's absolutely no evidence whatsoever of metalworks taking place. The tools aren't there because this is a site of metalworking. The tools are there because the smith is charged and the tools are put in the ground as part of these processes of killing and closure. So when we find metalworking tools, we shouldn't be necessarily assuming that that is where metalworking is taking place. Instead, it can be part of structured depositions that are happening with creation and destruction of buildings and monuments in the landscape as well.
So a life cycle process. And you think this was being described on picture stones as well?
And in terms of the evidence from Rhynie, the famous picture stone, the Rhynie man, has been interpreted as having an axe hammer. And I think that sort of description of axe hammer really covers our slight uncertainty whether this is actually a hammer or an axe to some extent. It's been compared to the one that's found in the Sutton Hoo ship burial. And again, this has been seen as more of a hammer and perhaps as a sort of a poleaxe object for the killing of cattle, the ritual killing of cattle. I'm more interested in seeing it as a metalworking hammer. It's a slightly unusual thing in the picture of the Rhynie man, but fascinatingly at Sutton Hoo, if we're thinking of smiths as curators of destruction and overseers of closing processes, at Sutton Hoo, the famous Mound 1 ship burial, now incredibly famous because of the Netflix series The Dig, which I'm mentioning a huge amount in every time I cover the 7th century in my teaching. But at Sutton Hoo, the axe hammer object is the first thing to go into the ground. It seems to be the first object in the burial. So are we seeing again the smith there as being the sort of initiator of the closing process of the burial? It's an interesting idea. So you can see it as cherry picking, but the evidence is quite consistent when you've got these high status sites, and the patterns are there. And you can't argue, I don't think, that people saw metalworkers in exactly the same way across different parts of Europe. But when you start to get cohesive assemblages of evidence across Northwest Europe, the case becomes more compelling, I think.
Talking now about developing kingship, how do you see the smiths fitting in with the ambitions of the power structures in the early period?
So we're seeing the smith as a hugely important individual in early rulership. The title of the paper is The Crafters of Kingship, and it's called that because in those earliest political systems in the 5th and 6th centuries, these objects are absolutely fundamental to the creation and the reproduction of power. And that's through something we understand we call reciprocal gift exchange. So that's when you have a leader. They style themselves as kings, certainly in England from about 600. I'm not sure we'd recognise them as that ourselves, and certainly not in a later medieval sense. But these people are mostly acquiring their wealth from war, from taking new lands in and then exacting tribute and booty and sharing that out with their loyal followers. And the followers give some of that material back. So these objects aren't just shiny things that are pretty and just show your wealth, but actually they're fundamental to establishing hierarchies and reproducing them and maintaining them as well. So the smiths in that very earliest period are literally the crafters of kingship and crafters of rulership.
Yeah, I'm really interested in this idea of the special role of the smith. It's a ceremonial role, an outsider's role. And when you talk about the gender of the smith, you are really looking to break a few stereotypes.
The gender aspect comes in because, first of all, we need to get rid of that idea of the smith as purely a male individual, that kind of 19th century blacksmith image, the kind of Joe Gargery, Great Expectations idea that we have and what we have in the post-medieval period. The burial evidence from parts of Europe, especially from Norway, shows that individuals, both male and female, are going into the ground with metalworking tools, so it's not exclusively a male industry. But the gender aspect in particular is that smithcraft seems to lie beyond any typical gender roles as we understand it in early medieval society. Now, I'm going to say that we understand weapon carrying as male and other things like textile weaving as female. Even that is being questioned now by ongoing research, and that's really an interesting area. So we can't put those up as comparators, but even more so, smithing doesn't seem to inhabit a particular gender role. We see that in anthropology as well, from more modern and recent anthropology, is that an interesting theme that comes out is those that take part in the metalworking process, be that smelting and smithing, especially sexual reproduction, seems to be off limits. And it's almost like their reproductive capacity goes into the metalworking process. And this may have been true in the early medieval period as well. And thinking about it in terms of gender, the particular thing seems to be the reproductive capacity of these individuals is in some way other. And so we see in a lot of the later sources, the Norse sources in particular, that smiths are individuals that live alone, isolated. They don't have families, they don't have partners. And for social rather than biological reasons, they can't reproduce, and they're very much on the limits. They're others, they're sort of curators of the liminals, the term I use.
So a supernatural aspect as well.
And it may be that beyond genders as well, they lay beyond the sort of ideas of the known world, the gods and the human world, and also the sort of the animal world. There's hints there of shape-shifting and animals coming into it. Wayland himself in that story fashions himself bird-like wings. He literally transforms into a bird to escape his island prison. So there are these hints of this shamanic being beyond human and animal forms as well. So there's lots of interesting ideas of Smiths lying on the peripheries.
And what about when belief systems started to change?
So what happens, I think, with increasing influence of the Christian church, and I don't like to think of it necessarily as a conversion period, because I think things in terms of practice are happening at such different times in different parts of Northwest Europe. As I already mentioned, Scandinavia and the later conversion there. But even in the British Isles as well, we have different influences. And what's actually happening with people's belief and their ideologies is inconsistent. But clearly from around the year 600, we have a growing influence, especially from Roman Francia into Britain, of the church there. And we do see the Smiths slowly, the status changing, but not initially, I don't think. Initially, these individuals who are hugely important in royal courts, who live on the periphery, who may be gendered unusually or distinctly, actually many of these things, and they're high status people as well, especially the elite smiths, that kind of fits the role of early clerics. So you could be describing a hermit, somebody who lives on the periphery, who's associated with royal courts, in some ways a ritual practitioner or specialist. So you see actually the perpetuation of this. And actually when looking at Glastonbury Tour and people trying to think, well, is this pre-Christian or is it Christian? Actually, I think in that initial period, and that dating of that, it doesn't really matter. I think the church perpetuates that.
But the early church liked to co-opt. It had strategies of appropriation.
We see the rise in the 6th and 7th centuries of saintly smiths, individuals like St. Eloi, Bishop Tournai, I think he is, who are very much clerics, but they are very capable metalworkers as well. And so they, I think to some extent, the long-filled shoes of sacred crafters are appropriated by the church. And we see these sites actually being occupied and continuing for some time. It's only later in the conversion process and where we get more standardized Christian practice that we see that begin to change. And I think that's really from the 9th century that we see monastic orders in particular trying to structure their space. There's a quote that I use from the 9th century where crafters are instructed to, from now on, undertake their work within the vallum and not without, as they have done in the past. And I think that quote's really insightful, not only telling us that they're desiring to bring greater structure and these individuals into the monastic sphere, but also that before, the tradition in the past was that these individuals lived in the landscape, they lived beyond the settlement cause and the elite focus of that earlier period as well. So we do see that begin to change. And the Smith becomes, I think it is a problem for the church. You've got these individuals who are acting as supernatural overseers, supernatural creators and destroyers of objects and things that might have been seen as in some way having lives and livelihoods. We're familiar with object biographies, but do we see things like halls and monuments in the same way? And that does knock heads with the idea of the ultimate creator God. And so I think that's where the tension starts to come in. And the Smith actually is later styled as either they are really holy and devout, and people like Dunstan, 10th century cleric and famous archbishop, somebody like him, he's seen as a smith. There's absolutely no evidence whatsoever that he is a smith in his lifetime. But clerics just become smiths because they almost have the God-given gifts of smithcraft. It's what you do if you're a cleric. Contrasting to that, there are all these moralistic tales of smiths who aren't devout, who fall in love with their craft and their object, and the focus of moralistic tales. You never see smiths just being normal people, some conflicted characters. They're either extremely holy or extremely not holy. And so I think that's actually a bit of an overhang of these individuals and an overhang of this process of smiths coming into Christian spheres and becoming normalised.
And in terms of future research, the Christian period saw the refocusing of metalwork in towns and growing urbanisation. So where do you take this from here?
Yeah, I think what the paper doesn't touch upon, it's partly to do with word limit really and the scope of the research, but is urbanism and what is happening there. That's the natural next step for part of the project. Part of my interest would be to look at the urban sites as well. The early interest of the church in Roman towns, we don't have the same continuity as we see in places like Gaul, of course, but initially the bishops reusing Roman towns like Canterbury and later Minsters, from the 8th century we see Minsters also appropriating Roman remains as well. Part of the reason for looking at sites in the countryside, the rural landscape, was that my interest sort of spanned that period. So the 5th and 6th centuries, certainly moving into the 7th century, where power centres are still in the countryside, I suppose, and looking at that relationship. But towns are obviously the next stage of things, but they are a massive subject area in themselves, if you like. So the process of that, and I think the role of the church within that, as you allude to, and certainly monasticism will be really interesting. But I've not yet been brave enough to put my foot into that sort of arena just because of the scale of the evidence. And I initially looked at the evidence from places like bringing these early power centres that come up from about 600, the year 600, and it's before the towns come into their own and something else is going on.
Do you think the situation must have been very different in a later urban context?
I mean, James Graham Campbell made a really sort of prescient observation, I think it's about 30 or 40 years ago, but struck upon just the idea of smiths and their role within urbanism partly as well, and says that the laws of Ian, the sort of early kingship laws, that the smith is the king's man, but by the time of the laws of Alfred, the smith is a normal person going about his business. And there is the slight risk that you might lose some of the interesting, royal, exciting smithing stuff looking at the urban side of things, because certainly by, I think, the 9th century, you're seeing far more prosaic smithcraft going on, and they're losing that intimacy and that importance with royal power. And I think also as royal power changes as well, and of course individuals in the later period, by the 10th, 11th century, they're still important figureheads. They're still partly seen as war leaders, and they are war leaders. But that idea of reciprocal gift exchange is not the only basis of their power. They now have the church. They also have the church and land. Extraction of land becomes sort of the basis, the economic basis of their power. So the ideological foundation and also the kind of economic foundation of their power has changed by that later period. So when towns start to become more prominent, so I think you might be looking at almost a very different relationship at that time, and also almost a different project could be done there.
Well, thanks very much for talking through this, Duncan. I've really enjoyed this fascinating subject. That brings us to the end of another episode. If you're enjoying Foreign Countries, please become a patron. Just visit the website foreigncountries.podbean.com and click the Patron button.